My girlfriend betrayed me, so we quickly divorced. When her second affair failed, she crawled back to me on her knees, begging for a second chance. Hey Reddit, I don't even know how to start this, but I guess I'll just dive in. I'm Mark, 38, a computer programmer, and I've been married to Emily, 34, for the last 8 years. We've had ups and downs, but I thought we were solid. That was until a single discovery flipped my whole world upside down. It started innocently enough, or at least, I thought it was innocent. Emily had left for work, and I needed to grab some receipts she'd stashed in her car glove compartment for taxes. As I opened the door and leaned into the passenger seat to rummage through her mess of takeout napkins, lipstick, and random junk, I saw something that made my stomach churn. It was a piece of underwear, a lacy, light pink thong, tucked partially under the passenger seat. At first, I thought it was hers, but something felt off. Emily isn't the kind of woman to toss her underwear in her car. She's meticulous about that kind of thing. Plus, the style wasn't really hers. She's more into simple, comfortable stuff. I picked it up, just staring at it, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was hers, maybe I was overthinking, maybe, but the thoughts were racing and I couldn't stop them. I felt a knot tightening in my chest as the most disturbing possibility hit me. What if it wasn't hers at all? What if she wasn't just keeping busy at work like she always claimed? I tried to ignore it for the rest of the day, but my brain wouldn't let it go. That night, I casually asked, "Hey, do you ever leave clothes in the car?" Emily didn't even look up from her phone when she answered. No, why? I didn't push. I wasn't ready to accuse her of anything, yet. But now, I had to know for sure. Emily works at a local real estate office as a marketing coordinator. Her job often requires her to stay late, meeting clients or preparing listings. At least, that's what she told me. Over the last few months, she'd been coming home later and later, her explanations getting vaguer. I had a meeting. We were staging a house. Traffic was awful. The excuses always sounded plausible, until now. That night, while she was asleep, I went hunting for answers. Emily had an old work phone she barely used anymore, and I knew she hadn't bothered to wipe it. It was in the drawer of our home office, buried under a stack of papers. After an hour of YouTube tutorials and password resets, I managed to get into it. The phone didn't have much, but it did have one thing: a GPS tracking app still connected to her account. It hadn't been updated in ages, but the app still worked. I couldn't believe my luck. I set it up to track her in real time, syncing it to my own phone. I didn't sleep much that night, and by morning, I had a plan. I'd let her go about her usual routine, pretending I hadn't noticed anything. But now, I'd know exactly where she was. 2 days later, I got my first hit. Emily had told me she was working late again. Something about a last-minute meeting with a new client. Around 6:30 p.m., I checked the tracking app. I expected her to be at the real estate office on Main Street, but she wasn't. Her location pinged at a small cafe across town. It wasn't too suspicious at first. I mean, maybe she was grabbing coffee with a client. But as I watched the dot on the screen, it didn't move. For over an hour, she stayed parked in the same spot. By 8 p.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I texted her, "How's work going?" Her reply came instantly, "Busy, might be late tonight. Love you." I stared at her text, my stomach turning. She was lying. She wasn't at work. When Emily came home around 10 p.m., I was ready to confront her. But the second she walked through the door, all the anger I'd built up drained away. She looked tired, exhausted, even, and gave me a quick kiss before heading straight to the shower. "Long day?" I called after her. "Yeah, brutal," she replied over the sound of running water. I stood there, staring at the closed bathroom door, feeling like a coward. I couldn't do it. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, I tracked her movements obsessively. Some days, she went straight to work and came home. Other days, she'd spend hours in places she had no reason to be. A park on the other side of town, a hotel parking lot, the same cafe from before. I started noticing other small things too. She was glued to her phone constantly, laughing at texts she wouldn't share. Her excuses for staying late became even more flimsy, and she seemed oddly distant whenever we were alone. One night, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. Locked, of course. But I'd seen her type in her password before. It was her birth year, 1987. I typed it in, and bingo, I was in. Her texts were mostly innocent, but there was one thread that stopped me cold. A string of messages with someone named R. No full name, no photo, just an initial. The texts were vague but damning. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. When can we meet again?" I told him I'm working late tomorrow, so I'm free after 7. My hands were shaking. I screenshotted everything and sent it to myself before locking her phone and putting it back where I found it. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own house. Emily kissed me goodbye like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't even look at her. As soon as she left, I called in sick to work and started digging deeper. I found R in her contacts. It was saved as just a number with no name. I called it, my heart pounding, but it went straight to voicemail. A man's voice, deep and smooth, said, "Hey, it's Ryan. Leave a message." Ryan. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. That's where I am right now, Reddit. I haven't confronted her yet, but I'm on the verge. I feel like I'm going crazy, like I'm living in someone else's life. What do I do? How do I even begin to untangle this mess? After weeks of piecing together scraps of information, I was convinced that Emily was lying to me. I wasn't just dealing with vague suspicions anymore. This was something concrete, undeniable. The messages, the strange locations, the secrecy. All of it painted a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. I needed more proof, though. Something so irrefutable that even she couldn't explain it away. One Friday night, Emily told me she had a corporate party at a bar downtown. She'd been acting distracted all day, checking her phone constantly, smiling at texts she wouldn't share with me. When I casually asked who was going to the party, she waved it off. "The whole team," she said. "Jason, Megan, probably Sarah too. Just the usual work crowd." Jason. I'd heard that name before. He was one of her colleagues at the office. She mentioned him often enough in passing, too often, in hindsight. But the way she said his name now had an edge to it, like she was trying to make it sound casual but couldn't quite pull it off. Something about it set me on edge. That evening, I told her I'd be working late on a coding project and wouldn't be waiting up. She seemed relieved, almost eager, as she kissed me goodbye and headed out the door in a little black dress I hadn't seen her wear in years. It wasn't the kind of dress you wore to a casual work party. It was the kind of dress you wore to impress someone. As soon as she was out of sight, I grabbed my coat, my car keys, and my phone. The tracking app was already open. Her location pinged at a bar downtown, just like she said. But I wasn't taking her word for anything anymore. I got in my car and drove to the bar, parking a block away where I could watch the entrance without being seen. It didn't take long to spot her. Emily was standing near the entrance, laughing at something Jason had said. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of overconfident smirk that made me want to punch him on sight. He leaned in close to her, his hand brushing her arm, and she didn't pull away. My stomach churned. This wasn't just a friendly conversation between colleagues. There was an intimacy in the way they interacted, a familiarity that set my blood boiling. I sat there for over an hour, watching them through the window as they drank and laughed with the rest of her coworkers. At one point, Jason slipped his arm around her waist, and she let him. She leaned into him, even. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm in there, demand answers, but I forced myself to stay put. This wasn't the moment to confront her. I needed more. Around midnight, the party started to wind down. People began filtering out of the bar, saying their goodbyes. Emily and Jason were among the last to leave. I watched as they stepped out onto the sidewalk together, her arm hooked around his, laughing at something he said. My heart sank as I saw them walk to his car. I followed at a safe distance, my headlights off, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. They drove for about 15 minutes before pulling into the parking lot of a small boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. I parked across the street, watching as they got out of the car. Jason walked around to her side, opening the door for her like a perfect gentleman. She smiled up at him, and they walked into the hotel together, arm in arm. That was it. The final nail in the coffin. I sat there in the dark, staring at the hotel entrance, my mind racing. There was no longer any doubt. Emily was cheating on me. And not just some one-time mistake. This was planned, deliberate. She had lied to my face, over and over again, and I had let her. I don't know how long I sat there, replaying everything in my head, but at some point, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let her humiliate me like this any longer. If she wanted to destroy our marriage, fine. But I wasn't going to sit around and let it happen quietly. I needed to take control of my life again, to stop living in denial and start making decisions for myself. The first thing I did was take out my phone and snap a few photos of her car in the parking lot. Then I took a picture of the hotel entrance, making sure to get the sign in the frame. If she ever tried to deny this, I wanted proof. Cold, hard proof. It felt sick and twisted, playing detective in my own marriage, but I didn't care anymore. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. I drove home in a daze, my mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she told me? How many nights had she spent with him while I was sitting at home, trusting her, believing her excuses? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was seething. I spent the rest of the night going through everything. Her emails, her texts, her social media. I found more than I bargained for. There were photos of them together at work events, little inside jokes in the comments, even a few private messages that made my stomach turn. She had been careful, but not careful enough. The pieces were all there, and they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. That would come later, when I was ready. But I wasn't going to sit around and wait for her to come clean, either. I started making plans, figuring out my next steps. If she wanted out of this marriage, I'd give her what she wanted. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her. When Emily came home the next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, said she was exhausted from the party, and went straight to bed. I stood there, watching her, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I didn't say anything. I just let her go, knowing that this was the beginning of the end. My life was about to change, and I wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. I didn't know exactly what my next move would be, but one thing was certain. I was done being a victim. It was time to take my life back. After the hotel incident, my life felt like a blur. Days turned into weeks, and I kept going through the motions like a robot. Wake up, work, avoid Emily, repeat. I was careful not to let her know I was onto her. The truth was, I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment to leave. But pretending everything was fine while I carried this burden, it was eating me alive. That's how I found myself at a bar one Friday night, drowning in whiskey and trying to forget the mess my life had become. The place wasn't anything fancy. Dim lights, sticky floors, and the faint smell of stale beer. Just the kind of no-questions-asked dive I needed. I was nursing my second drink when a deep, gravelly voice interrupted my thoughts. "Mind if I sit here?" the man asked, gesturing to the bar stool next to me. I glanced up and saw a big guy in a plaid shirt and worn jeans. He looked like the kind of guy who could wrestle a bear and still have energy left to plow a field. There was something disarming about him, though. His eyes were kind, almost fatherly. I shrugged. "Go ahead." He ordered a beer and started talking, as people in bars often do. His name was Mike, and he was a 45-year-old farmer from out of town. He told me about his ranch, a 40-acre spread about 80 kilometers from the city. "It's quiet out there," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "Peaceful. You'd be surprised how much better life feels when you're not surrounded by all this chaos." I wasn't in the mood for small talk, but there was something about Mike's voice, steady, calm, like he had life all figured out. I found myself opening up, telling him more than I should have. I told him about Emily, about the betrayal, about how I felt like I was suffocating in my own home. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, like he'd heard it all before. "You know," he said after a while, "you don't have to stay in that mess. Life's too short to waste it on people who don't appreciate you." "Yeah, well, it's not that simple," I muttered. "We've got a house, shared bills." Mike waved a hand dismissively. "Excuses, my friend. You don't need a mansion to be happy. Hell, you don't even need a house. What you need is freedom." "Freedom," I repeated, rolling the word around in my head. It sounded good, almost too good to be true. Mike leaned in closer, like he was about to tell me a secret. "I've got an old trailer sitting on my property. Nothing fancy, but it's solid. Got all the basics, bed, kitchen, running water. I've been meaning to sell it, but I'll make you a deal. 15 grand and it's yours." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. 15 grand? For a trailer? "It's a damn good trailer," he said with a chuckle. "And you won't just be buying a trailer, you'll be buying a fresh start. Move out to the ranch, get away from all this noise." Think about it. I don't know if it was the whiskey talking or the desperation in my soul, but the idea didn't sound crazy. In fact, it sounded like salvation. We exchanged numbers that night, and over the next few days, I thought about his offer constantly. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had some savings, enough to cover the cost of the trailer, and the idea of leaving the city, leaving Emily, leaving everything behind. It felt like the lifeline I desperately needed. The following weekend, I drove out to see Mike's ranch. The place was everything he described and more. Rolling fields, a small pond, and a sky so open it made the city feel claustrophobic by comparison. The trailer was parked near a cluster of trees at the edge of the property. It was old, sure, but well-maintained. Inside, it was cozy. A small living area, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a bedroom with just enough space for a queen-sized bed. It wasn't much, but it felt like home in a way my house never had. Mike gave me the grand tour, pointing out all the little quirks and features. "This baby's got good bones," he said, patting the wall. "You'll be comfortable here. And if you need anything, I'm just up the hill." I didn't need much convincing. I shook his hand and agreed to the deal on the spot. We worked out a payment plan, and I started moving my things in that very week. Emily didn't suspect a thing. She was too busy with her late nights and her secret rendezvous to notice the boxes disappearing from the garage. At first, it was just small stuff. Clothes, books, personal items I could sneak out without raising suspicion. I'd tell Emily I was going to the gym or running errands, then drive out to the ranch and unload my car. It felt like I was living a double life, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had control over something. Every box I moved was a step closer to freedom. Mike was a godsend during this time. He helped me set up the trailer, gave me tips on living off the grid, and even invited me over for dinner a few times. His wife, Linda, was just as warm and welcoming as he was. They treated me like family, like I belonged there. It was a stark contrast to the cold, distant atmosphere back at home. One night, as we sat on Mike's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to me and said, "You know, Mark, I've seen a lot of guys like you. Stuck in bad situations, too scared to make a change. Most of them never do. But you've got guts. You're doing what most people only dream about." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't just running away, I was rebuilding. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. By the end of the month, the trailer was fully stocked, and I was ready to make my move. I hadn't told Emily yet. I didn't know how to, or even if I should. Part of me wanted to disappear without a word. Let her come home to an empty house and figure it out for herself. But another part of me wanted closure, to look her in the eye and tell her exactly how badly she'd hurt me. As I packed the last of my belongings into my car, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief, fear, anger, and a strange sense of excitement. This was it, the beginning of the end. Or maybe, the beginning of something entirely new. Living my double life between the house and the trailer became a strange, exhausting routine. I was like a ghost in my own home, tiptoeing around Emily while secretly plotting my escape. She barely noticed at first, too wrapped up in her own world, her late nights, and her excuses. But eventually, something shifted. She started to pick up on my changes. It started small. One night, I caught her watching me while I ate dinner. Her fork hovered in the air as she studied me, her eyes narrowing like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. "You've been quiet lately," she said, breaking the silence. "Just tired," I replied, not looking up from my plate. "You've been tired a lot," she pressed. "Is something wrong?" I forced a shrug. "Work's been crazy." She didn't seem convinced, but she let it go. For the next few days, though, she started paying more attention. She'd ask where I was going when I left the house, even if it was just to the grocery store. She started texting me during the day, little check-ins that felt more like surveillance than genuine concern. "Hey, how's your day going? Where are you? Thought you'd be home by now. Everything okay?" It was almost laughable. For months, she'd barely noticed my existence, and now she was suddenly hyper-aware of my every move. Part of me wondered if she felt guilty, if maybe, deep down, she knew I was slipping away and was trying to reel me back in. But it was too late for that. One evening, I came home to find her cooking dinner, something she hadn't done in years. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, and there were candles on the table, casting a warm, romantic glow. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought we could have a nice dinner tonight," she said, gesturing to the table. I hesitated in the doorway, caught off guard. "What's the occasion? Do I need a reason to cook for my husband?" she asked, her tone light but her gaze sharp. She was watching me closely, searching for a reaction. I sat down, forcing a neutral expression. The food was good, better than I remembered, but I couldn't enjoy it. The tension in the air was suffocating. Emily kept trying to make conversation, asking about my day, my work, my plans for the weekend. I answered in monosyllables, keeping my walls firmly in place. Halfway through the meal, she put down her fork and leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "Mark, I feel like we've been distant lately. Is everything okay between us?" The irony of her question almost made me laugh. Instead, I took a sip of water and avoided her gaze. "Yeah, everything's fine. Fine, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. Mark, you barely talk to me anymore. You're gone all the time, and when you are home, it's like you're not really here. What's going on? I set down my glass, meeting her eyes for the first time that night. I could ask you the same thing. She froze, her face paling. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny everything, but then she let out a shaky laugh. I don't know what you're talking about, don't you? I asked, my voice cold. The words hung between us, heavy and damning. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. After a long, awkward silence, she stood up and started clearing the plates. I didn't stop her. Over the next few weeks, Emily tried harder. She'd leave little notes for me to find. On the bathroom mirror, in my lunch on my nightstand. Thinking of you and hope you have a great day. She started making more of an effort to be home in the evenings, offering to watch movies together or go out for dinner. It was like she was trying to rewind the clock, to go back to a time when things were good between us. But for me, it was too late. The damage was done. Every kind gesture, every attempt to reconnect, only reminded me of the lies she'd told and the betrayal I couldn't forget. I couldn't pretend anymore. I was already gone, emotionally if not physically. One night, after another failed attempt at a romantic evening, Emily finally snapped. I don't know what else to do, Mark, she shouted, throwing her hands in the air. I'm trying to fix this, but it's like you don't even care. I looked at her, feeling a strange mix of pity and anger. Maybe that's because I don't. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she was going to cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and nodded, her expression hardening. Okay, she said quietly, if that's how you feel. The next morning, I found divorce papers on the kitchen counter. She didn't say a word about them, but I saw her watching me out of the corner of her eye as I read through the documents. She wanted a quick process, a clean break. No drawn-out arguments, no messy court battles. It was almost like she was giving me an easy out, like she was tired of fighting a battle she knew she couldn't win. I signed the papers without hesitation. There was nothing left to fight for. The next 6 months were a blur of legal proceedings, paperwork, and awkward interactions. Emily moved out of the house and into an apartment closer to her office. I stayed in the house until the divorce was finalized, then sold it and moved full-time to the trailer on Mike's ranch. It wasn't an easy transition, but it felt right. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The day our divorce was finalized, I got a text from Emily. I hope you find what you're looking for. Take care, Mark. I stared at the message for a long time before finally deleting it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. After the divorce, life at Mike's ranch was both strange and liberating. I hadn't realized how much of my energy had been spent trying to navigate the minefield that was my marriage. Now, with the weight of Emily's betrayal and our relationship finally off my shoulders, I felt like I could breathe again. The ranch was beautiful, a far cry from the sterile, gray city I'd spent so much of my life in. Rolling hills stretched out as far as the eye could see, dotted with patches of wildflowers and clusters of trees. The air smelled clean, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth after it rained. For the first time in years, I started waking up early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I'd sit on the steps of my trailer, sipping coffee as the sun rose, watching the light spill over the fields. It was quiet, peaceful in a way I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Mike was true to his word. He was always around if I needed help or advice, but he gave me space to figure things out for myself. He'd stop by every now and then, leaning against the doorframe of the trailer with his usual easy grin. How's the new life treating you? He'd ask. Better than I expected, I'd admit, and I meant it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself. One of the first things I did was start exploring the land around the ranch. Mike had mentioned there were trails winding through the woods nearby, and I figured it was time to put my old hiking boots to use. The first few times, I stuck to the well-trodden paths, taking in the scenery and getting a feel for the area. But as the days went by, I started venturing further, following deer trails and scrambling up rocky inclines to see what was beyond the next hill. Hiking became my therapy. Every step felt like I was leaving a piece of my old life behind, shedding the anger and bitterness that had clung to me for so long. I'd come back to the trailer sweaty and exhausted, but with a clear head and a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, while I was on one of my usual hikes, I heard someone calling out. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. I stopped, straining to listen, and heard it again. A woman's voice, somewhere off the trail. Curious and a little concerned, I followed the sound, pushing through a thicket of bushes until I came across her. She was crouched on the ground, inspecting a map that was clearly doing her no favors. She had dark hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, a smear of dirt on her cheek, and an annoyed expression that made me stifle a laugh. "Need some help?" I asked, startling her. She looked up, startled, then let out a sheepish laugh. "That obvious, huh?" "Kind of," I said, nodding at the map. "You lost?" "Completely," she admitted, standing up and brushing dirt off her pants. "I thought this trail looped back around, but I've been wandering for an hour, and I'm starting to think I'm just going in circles." I glanced at the map she was holding. It was an old, wrinkled thing that looked like it had been stuffed in a backpack for years. No wonder she was lost. "You're not too far off," I said, pointing to a spot on the map. "If you head this way, you'll hit the main trail again in about 15 minutes. She looked where I was pointing, then back at me, her brow furrowing. "You sure?" "Positive. I've been exploring these trails for weeks. Trust me, I know them like the back of my hand." She tilted her head, studying me with a curious smile. "So, what are you, some kind of forest guide?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not exactly. Just a guy with too much free time." "Well, forest guide or not, you just saved me from spending the night out here," she said, tucking the map into her backpack. "Thanks, Mark," I said, extending a hand. "Sarah," she replied, shaking it. Her grip was firm, her hand warm and calloused. She looked like someone who was no stranger to hard work. We ended up walking back to the main trail together, chatting along the way. Sarah was 29, a graphic designer from a nearby town who spent her weekends hiking and camping. She'd come out to the trails looking for a bit of solitude, but had clearly underestimated how easy it was to get turned around out here. When we reached the main trail, she stopped and turned to me with a grin. "Thanks again for the help, Mark. I owe you one." "Anytime," I said, watching as she disappeared down the path. I didn't think much of it at first, but a week later, I ran into her again. This time, she was better prepared. No map, just a GPS app on her phone and a backpack full of supplies. She waved when she saw me, jogging over with a wide smile. "Hey, forest guide," she called out. "Fancy seeing you here." "Sarah," I said, surprised but not unhappy to see her. "Getting lost again?" "Not this time," she said, holding up her phone. "But I wouldn't mind some company if you're up for it." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, why not?" We ended up hiking together for the rest of the afternoon, talking about everything and nothing. She was funny, sharp, and refreshingly straightforward. A stark contrast to the guarded, manipulative energy I'd grown used to with Emily. There was no pretense with Sarah, no hidden agenda. She was just herself. Over the next few weeks, we started running into each other more often. At first, it seemed like coincidence, but eventually, I realized she was seeking me out, and I didn't mind. Hiking with her was easy, natural, and for the first time in a long time, I found myself looking forward to spending time with someone. Our relationship started off casual, just two people enjoying each other's company. But as time went on, it became clear there was something more between us. She'd tease me about being a hermit in the woods, and I'd joke about her getting lost without me. We'd share stories about our lives, our struggles, our hopes for the future. It was light and fun, but there was a depth to it that I hadn't expected. One evening, as we sat by the edge of a creek watching the sun dip below the trees, she turned to me with a soft smile. "You're different out here," she said. "Different how?" I asked, curious. "More alive," she said simply. "Like this is where you're supposed to be." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. And Sarah, she was a big part of that. Our relationship didn't come with labels or expectations. It was just two people healing, finding comfort in each other's company. And for now, that was enough. It had been a year and a half since the divorce, and my life had taken on a rhythm I never thought possible. Days were filled with hikes, projects on the ranch, and occasional trips into the nearby town for supplies or a coffee at the local diner. The wounds Emily left behind had mostly healed, thanks in no small part to the simple, quiet life I'd built and Sarah's calming presence. Sarah and I weren't anything serious, but we were good for each other. She helped me feel whole again, and I provided her with a sense of stability she'd been missing. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people enjoying life as it came. I didn't think much about Emily anymore. I had tucked that part of my life away, filed it under lessons learned, and moved on. That's why I wasn't prepared for what happened on an otherwise ordinary trip to a neighboring town. I'd driven out to Maplewood, about 30 minutes from the ranch, to pick up a few things from the hardware store. The town was small but charming, with a main street lined with boutique shops and cafes. After picking up some supplies, I decided to stop at a little coffee shop I'd been to a couple of times before. It was the kind of place where locals lingered over their drinks, chatting with the baristas like old friends. I was waiting for my order when I heard a voice behind me that froze me in place. Mark. It was her voice. I hadn't heard it in so long, but there was no mistaking it. I turned slowly, my stomach nodding, and there she was. Emily. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, her face a little thinner, and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was dressed in jeans and a casual sweater, a far cry from the polished, professional look she used to favor. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy in the air. Emily, I said, my voice carefully neutral. What are you doing here? She gave a small, nervous laugh, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I could ask you the same thing. I didn't know you lived around here. I don't, I said simply, glancing toward the counter where my coffee was being prepared. I'm just passing through, right? She said, shifting awkwardly. Me too. Well, kind of. I'm, staying with a friend nearby. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. The barista called my name, and I grabbed my coffee, ready to leave. But Emily wasn't done. Mark, wait, she said, stepping closer. Can we talk? Just for a minute? I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away. But there was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability, regret. Against my better judgment, I nodded. Okay, a minute. We found a table near the back, away from the other patrons. I sat down, gripping my coffee like a lifeline, while Emily fidgeted with the strap of her bag. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I don't even know where to start, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. How about the truth? I suggested, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She flinched but nodded. Okay, the truth. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. I messed up, Mark. I know that now. I've been thinking about what I did, about everything, and I realize how much I hurt you. I'm so sorry. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept her apology and move on. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the nights she lied to my face, wasn't so sure. I appreciate the apology, I said finally. But why now, Emily? Why after all this time? She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. Because I've been through hell, and it made me realize what I threw away. Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard before continuing. Jason, things with him didn't work out. He cheated on me, Mark. He cheated on me with one of our coworkers, and everyone found out. It turned into this huge scandal, and I lost my job because of it. My reputation is ruined. I stared at her, a mix of disbelief and something close to satisfaction washing over me. I knew it was petty, but I couldn't help it. The woman who had destroyed our marriage for Jason was now sitting across from me, broken and humiliated because of him. It was poetic in a way. I'm sorry that happened to you, I said, my tone even. And I was sorry in the way you might feel sorry for a stranger's misfortune. But I didn't feel the kind of sympathy she was clearly hoping for. Emily wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. I deserve this. I know I do. But it's made me realize how much I took you for granted, Mark. You were good to me better than I deserved. And I threw it all away for nothing. I took a long sip of my coffee, letting her words hang in the air. You're right about one thing, I said finally. You did throw it all away. She flinched again, and for a moment, I thought she was going to get up and leave. But instead, she leaned forward, her eyes pleading. Mark, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want a chance to make things right. I want us to have a fresh start. I froze, her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. A fresh start? After everything? The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. Emily, I said, my voice low but firm, you don't get to ask for that. You don't get to come back into my life after a year and a half and act like we can just start over. That's not how this works. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. I pulled away. Please, Mark, she whispered. I've changed. I've learned from my mistakes. I just want a chance to prove it to you. I shook my head, standing up and grabbing my coffee. You had your chance, Emily, and you blew it. I'm not the same man you left behind, and I don't owe you anything. She looked up at me, her expression crumbling, but I didn't stay to watch her fall apart. I walked out of the coffee shop, my heart pounding, and didn't look back. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, the scenery blurring past as my mind raced. Part of me felt lighter, like I'd finally gotten some closure. But another part of me was angry. Angry that she thought she could waltz back into my life after everything she'd done. I wasn't the man she left behind. I was stronger now, wiser. And I wasn't about to let her drag me back into the chaos I'd fought so hard to escape. The encounter with Emily in Maplewood rattled me more than I wanted to admit. As much as I told myself I was over it, over her, it stirred something in me, a deep, uneasy mix of anger and pity. But it also reminded me why I had left that chapter of my life behind. I'd built something better now, something honest, even if it wasn't perfect. And I wasn't about to throw that away for someone who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted. A week after our awkward coffee shop meeting, I was out on a hike near the ranch, clearing my head as I often did. The sky was overcast, the air crisp with the promise of rain, and the familiar sound of gravel crunching underfoot was soothing. I thought about Sarah, how easy things had become with her, how much lighter my life felt since moving out here. The more I compared that to my old life with Emily, the more ridiculous her request for a fresh start seemed. But Emily wasn't done with me. I just returned to the trailer after the hike, damp from the drizzle that had started on my way back, when I saw her car parked near the ranch gate. She was leaning against the hood, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to deal with her, not here, not now. But I wasn't going to hide, either. "Emily," I said as I approached, keeping my voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" She straightened up, brushing her hair out of her face. "I needed to talk to you," she said. "And you didn't give me much of a chance last time." "Because there's nothing left to say," I replied, stopping a few feet away. "I thought we were clear on that." "I'm not here to fight," she said quickly, holding up her hands as if to show she meant no harm. I need you to hear me out. Please." I sighed, crossing my arms. "Fine. You've got 5 minutes." She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words, then took a step closer. "Mark, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I screwed up, and I know I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. But I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I don't want to leave things like this. I don't want you to hate me." "I don't hate you," I said flatly, "but that doesn't mean I trust you either." Her face fell, but she nodded. "I get that. I do. But I've changed, Mark. I've learned from my mistakes. And I know it's a long shot, but I'm asking you for another chance. I want to make things right between us." I shook my head, incredulous. "Emily, you don't get it. It's not about whether or not you've changed. It's about the fact that I can't go back. You broke something between us that can't be fixed. And honestly, I don't want to fix it. I've moved on." "I've noticed," she said bitterly, glancing toward the trailer. "Is that where you've been living? In a trailer? Out in the middle of nowhere?" "Yep," I said simply, refusing to take the bait. "And I'm happy here." She let out a frustrated laugh, throwing her hands in the air. "I don't get it, Mark. You had a life, a house, a career, a future, and now you're living out here like some kind of hermit." "Because this life is mine," I shot back, my voice rising. "Not something I built around someone else's lies. For the first time in years, I'm living for me. And I'm not giving that up. Not for you, not for anyone." She stared at me, stunned into silence. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then she took a shaky breath and said, "I'm moving." That caught me off guard. "Moving? To another state," she said, her voice quiet now. "A friend offered me a job in Colorado. It's a fresh start, and I think I need it." "That's probably for the best," I said, not unkindly. She nodded, biting her lip. "But before I go, I need to know, is there any part of you, any part at all, that still cares about me? That would even consider coming with me?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and charged. I knew my answer, but it still hurt to say it out loud. "No, Emily," I said finally. "That part of me doesn't exist anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "I see." For a moment, I thought she might argue, plead with me to reconsider. But instead, she stepped back, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I guess this is goodbye then." "I guess it is," I said, my tone firm but not cruel. She nodded again, then turned and got into her car. I watched as she drove away, the taillights disappearing down the dirt road. And just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where her car had been. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just a strange, quiet sense of finality. It was over. Whatever thread had tied us together was finally severed, and I was free. That night, as I sat on the steps of the trailer watching the stars, I thought about everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the long journey to find myself again. And I realized something. I didn't need Emily's apology, her approval, or her presence in my life. I was happy where I was, surrounded by the open sky and the quiet hum of nature. I'd built a life that was mine, and no one could take that away from me. When I finally went to bed, I slept better than I had in years.